Welcome back to the channel. This game continues the Brighton Zonal tournament in 1984, which Nigel was playing in. This is the fifth round game against Murray Chandler, another British Grandmaster. The game started as a Sicilian defence. The Najdorf variation in the English attack. Again, a variation we've seen Nigel play before, including this move, knight to d5. This actually threatens bishop b6 and knight c7 check winning the exchange. So knight bd7 stops that. f3 defends the e-pawn. Exchange of knights in the centre, and bishop to f5, a nice outpost for the black bishop. Nigel opts to try and exchange the bishop straight away, which is accepted, and both sides castle. a4 clamping down on the queen side, and bishop g5 offering another trade. Rook to c1, threatening c4 in some, well, c4 to sort of expand on the queen side a bit. And black decides to expand on the king side and with a view to maybe e4 at some stage. Nigel reroutes the knight, defending the e4 square and just getting it over to the king side, but e4 comes anyway. And here Chandler decides not to take the pawn back but play f4, hitting the bishop. Another option would have been knight to e5 after queen to 8 and the trade. Position's quite equal. Chandler's given up a pawn, but he's got a nice outpost for his knight on e5. We played f4, which again he's given up a pawn for some activity. And f3 again. Nigel could take the pawn. It looks a bit scary for white after the queen comes in and knight to e5, but even though it looks quite scary, I think the position is fairly equal. Although even though Nigel's actually 2 pawns up, black's got quite a lot of initiative. So Nigel decided not to go for that and play rook to f1. And after the rooks are traded, Nigel plays an Itzmetso move of knight to f3, hitting the bishop, and then takes the g pawn. So after all this, Nigel's emerged to sacrifice pawn up, and I'm not sure black's got enough for it, to be honest. The position is still quite equal though. Just ensuring the centre. And he decides to take back with the pawn doubling the pawns, but I think the idea is to break with e5 at some point. Hitting the e-pawn, which is defended. Queen check. And king to h1. Now it looks like black could potentially play knight takes d5 because of the pawn's pin on e4. But after queen to b3, the knight's lost. So obviously Chandler didn't fall for that. He played rook to e8, just putting more pressure on the e-pawn, which is defended. And I think here this is where black starts to go a bit wrong. He plays knight to g4, obviously eyeing the f2 square, knight f2 mate. But after queen to g3, I think he hasn't really got a plan of what to do. It's quite easily covered. He's still a pawn down, and he's got to justify why he's sacrificed. Rook to f8 renews the threat, and Nigel just defends. And this is another mistake, and it's quite a bad mistake. h5, the actual move is not bad, but what it does do is leave the queen undefended. So Nigel's next move, g3, h3 even, hits the knight and forces it to go to f2 because any other move would lose. Um, this obviously discovers the attack on the queen on g3, but Nigel can simply answer with king to g2, defending the queen, and after the queen trade and knight to d3, the knight looks a bit helpless out there. It could get back via f2, but knight to c4 is a good move, defending the b pawn with both rook and knight, and attacking d6. So black defends that, but then e5 comes, and this is the whole point of doubling the pawns a while back, to burst through the centre. Um, Chandler decides to take the pawn, and Nigel takes the pawn back as well. He could play d6, which would have been interesting with a view to take the pawn afterwards. But d takes e5, and now white is winning. These two pawns are going to become very dangerous. H4 check. The idea, obviously, you can't play king takes h4 because of rook f4 check, winning the knight. So king to h2, and Chandler plays rook to f4 anyway, hitting the knight. The problem is he didn't foresee Nigel's next move, which is actually winning, and after this move, Chandler resigned. The idea is obviously if you take the knight, then d6, and somehow you've got to stop the pawns, which you can't. You could have tried rook to f8 after e6, but e7, but d6, knight to c5, but then knight to b6 still threatens d7, and even then you can still kick the knight with b4, and white's just going to crash through and promote a pawn. So very good game from Nigel. Moved into 4.5 out of 5, and it was obviously joint top at the stage. And this gave him an opportunity to draw out the rest of the games. And he finished up with 6.5 out of 9 and qualified for the interzonal along with John Spillman. So, which was no mean achievement for a player so young. So you would get a tilt at the interzonal in 1985. This kind of wraps up 1984. There's a couple of games. There's a clock symbol game that he played that I'll put on at some point. But I think the plan will be to continue into 1985, where Nigel I think the first thing he did was play a match against the American champion Albert. But we'll join that when I come back. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the game and enjoying the channel. Any comments would be appreciated. Until next time, bye for now.